The crystalline court of the Ashvari dominion was designed to inspire awe and intimidate the insufficiently important. Queen Murethel sat on her throne, carved from compressed stardust and ancient authority, presiding over a chamber where light refracted through walls like frozen music. Her court moved in careful choreography, nobles positioning themselves with the precision of chess pieces, who knew exactly how many moves they had before irrelevance. Princess Nivara stood at the back of the assembly hall, trying to achieve invisibility through sheer force of will. She'd gotten good at it over 26 years. The art of existing without taking up space, of being present without being noticed, of breathing quietly so nobody remembered to be disappointed by her. Her sisters occupied the positions of honor. Karis, eldest and heir apparent, stood at the queen's right hand discussing fleet deployments with military commanders who hung on her every tactical brilliance. Silene, middle daughter and psychic prodigy, held court to the left, her abilities allowing her to sense intentions and reshape thoughts with the casual ease of someone who'd never known what it meant to be powerless. And then there was Nivara. No psychic gifts, no combat prowess, no political cunning, just a genetic anomaly in a family of legends, the mistake the queen had spent 26 years trying to politely ignore. The court called her the queen's oversight when they were being kind. When they weren't, the names got creative. "The human delegation has arrived," announced Chamberlain Vorath, his voice carrying the kind of formal disapproval that suggested humans were somehow personally offensive to proper protocol. Queen Murethel straightened imperceptibly, the movement suggesting she was about to handle something distasteful but necessary. "Send them in. Let's conclude this business efficiently." The humans entered with the kind of confidence that comes from either ignorance of proper court etiquette or complete disregard for it. 3 diplomats in formal wear that looked vaguely uncomfortable, and 1 man in practical work clothes that suggested he'd either missed the dress code memo or had decided it didn't apply to him. Daniel Reeves, Nivara's briefing packet had said, agricultural engineer from Earth's outer colonies, chosen for the matrimonial alliance because his family had no political connections that would complicate future negotiations. 32 years old, advanced degrees in sustainable farming and hydrology, absolutely no experience with alien nobility or the intricate social warfare of the crystalline court. He looked exactly like someone who'd be utterly destroyed by this place within a week. The lead diplomat began the formal negotiations with the kind of flowery language that probably sounded impressive in translation, but made Nivara want to apologize to linguistics as a concept. Trade agreements, mining rights, agricultural support for human colonies in exchange for Ashvari navigational data and medical technology. And the matrimonial clause, the diplomat concluded, to formalize the alliance and demonstrate our commitment to long-term cooperation. Queen Murethel's smile could have flash-frozen hydrogen. Yes, the marriage clause. How fortuitous that our youngest daughter is available for such an arrangement. Nivara felt the words like a physical blow, which was ridiculous because she'd known this was coming. Had been told 3 days ago that she was being married off to secure trade agreements and solve 2 problems simultaneously: the need for a human alliance and the embarrassment of a useless royal daughter. "Princess Nivara will make an excellent partner," the queen continued, her tone suggesting that excellent was being used in the most technical sense possible. "She has a gentle disposition and will adapt well to colonial life away from court responsibilities." Translation: she has no valuable skills and we're shipping her somewhere she can't embarrass us further. Daniel Reeves was looking at her now, and Nivara tried not to flinch under the attention. He didn't look cruel, which was something. Didn't look particularly impressed either, which was fair given that she was standing at the back of the assembly wearing robes that were ceremonial hand-me-downs, and trying to project confidence she absolutely didn't feel. "Hi," he said, which made approximately 6 diplomats inhale sharply at the breach of protocol. "I'm Daniel. This whole thing is weird, but I guess we're doing it." Nivara managed a nod. Her voice had apparently filed for early retirement somewhere around the moment her mother had publicly declared her disposable. The negotiations continued for another hour. Details about ceremony, legal frameworks, property rights. Nivara stopped listening around the point where they discussed her like cargo that needed proper documentation for interstellar shipping. The wedding was scheduled for 3 days hence, which was apparently enough time to formalize an alliance, and not enough time to properly plan a ceremony that the court actually cared about. Nivara returned to her chambers, which were beautiful and isolated in the way that expensive prisons often are. Her attendant, Lissa, had already begun packing with the efficiency of someone who'd expected this outcome. "The agricultural moon verdant 4, Lissa said quietly. "That's your posting. It's having crop failures, critical food supply issues. They need solutions or 3 systems start rationing within the year. So they're sending me to manage a crisis I'm completely unqualified for." Nivara sat on the edge of her bed, the embroidered covers probably worth more than the solutions she'd be expected to provide. "That's efficient. I can fail there, and it'll be my incompetence rather than court politics. Or," Lissa said carefully, "you could succeed. You're good at things, Nivara, you've just never been allowed to try them." "I'm good at being invisible and disappointing my mother. Those aren't marketable skills." The wedding happened on schedule, minimal ceremony, in a side chamber that usually hosted minor trade negotiations. A handful of required witnesses, no nobles who weren't legally obligated to attend, and a ceremony conducted by a priest who looked like he'd rather be performing rites for literally anyone else. Daniel wore formal clothing that still somehow looked practical, like he'd added pockets for tools and maybe emergency supplies. He said his vows clearly, looking at Nivara rather than through her, which was novel enough that she almost forgot to say her own responses. When they were pronounced married, he squeezed her hand gently. "We'll figure it out," he whispered. "Whatever this is, we'll figure it out together." Nivara wanted to believe him, wanted to think that maybe this wouldn't be just another way she disappointed everyone. But she'd spent 26 years learning that hope was expensive and she couldn't afford it. The court threw a reception that was really a masterclass in public humiliation disguised as celebration. Nobles who'd ignored Nivara for years suddenly had opinions about her marriage, her future, her complete lack of qualifications for anything resembling responsibility. The jokes were pointed enough to draw blood but polite enough to maintain deniability. "I hear Verdant 4 is lovely this time of year," Lady Nessara said with a smile that could cut glass. "Very remote, very quiet. Perfect for someone who prefers to avoid expectations." "The agricultural posting is certainly appropriate," Lord V. Harris added. "Manual labor suits those without other gifts." Daniel had somehow acquired a drink and was sipping it with the expression of someone cataloging data for later analysis. When a noble made a particularly pointed comment about breeding programs and genetic disappointments, he set down his glass carefully. "You know what's funny?" he said, his accent making the words sound more casual than they probably were. "Where I'm from, we have this saying about people who confuse being born lucky with being competent. Usually right before they starve because they don't actually know how to grow food." He smiled pleasantly. "Anyway, thanks for the party. We've got a shuttle to catch." The noble sputtered. Several others laughed, then caught themselves. Nivara felt something unfamiliar in her chest that might have been the beginning of hope or possibly just indigestion from stress. They left the crystalline court that evening, boarding a transport that would take 3 days to reach Verdant 4. The moon was visible in the viewport, green and cloud-wrapped, far from the center of power, forgotten by everyone who mattered. Nivara stood watching it approach, this place that would be her exile or her home, depending on how generous she felt about her circumstances. Daniel joined her at the viewport, holding 2 cups of something that smelled like earth coffee and tasted like optimism's distant cousin. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm pretty sure your mother is wrong about you. You don't know me." "No, but I know that nobody spends that much effort being cruel to someone who's actually useless. They ignore the useless ones. They only work that hard to diminish people they're threatened by. Naivara looked at him, at this human who'd been assigned to marry her like a diplomatic inconvenience, who defended her at a reception where she'd learned not to defend herself, who seemed to actually believe his own words. "I don't have any gifts," she said. "No psychic abilities, no combat skills, no political brilliance. I'm just able to stand in a court that spent years telling you you're worthless, and still be kind to your attendant and remember people's names, and not let them make you cruel." Daniel shrugged. "I don't know, that seems like a gift to me, just not the kind that gets you fancy titles." The transport jumped to faster than light, stars stretching into lines outside the viewport. Naivara held her terrible coffee and stood beside her unexpected husband, heading toward a posting designed to be failure, carrying nothing but years of being underestimated, and the strange, dangerous possibility that maybe everyone had been wrong. Queen Murethel watched the transport depart from her private chambers, congratulating herself on a successful negotiation. One daughter married off, human alliance secured, two problems solved with efficient diplomacy. She did not think about Naivara again for almost 5 years. That was her first mistake. Verdant 4 looked beautiful from orbit and significantly less so from ground level. The main settlement was functional in the way that frontier colonies are when they're built by people who prioritize not dying over aesthetic considerations. Prefab structures, muddy paths between buildings, and a landing pad that had clearly been repaired multiple times with whatever materials were available. Naivara stepped off the shuttle into humidity that immediately made her formal robes cling in uncomfortable ways. Daniel emerged behind her carrying both their bags because apparently chivalry wasn't dead, just pragmatic. "Atmospheric composition is great," he said, checking a handheld scanner. "Soil reports are concerning. Also, I think your outfit is melting." She looked down. Her ceremonial robes, designed for the climate-controlled elegance of the crystalline court, were indeed having opinions about Verdant 4's weather, and those opinions were negative. The settlement administrator approached, a weathered woman named Kessa who looked like she'd seen too many crop failures and not enough budget increases. "Princess, Engineer Reeves, welcome to Verdant 4. I'd apologize for the conditions, but honestly, this is better than usual." "What's usual?" Naivara asked. "Mud season, 6 months where you sink to your knees if you stand still too long." Kessa gestured toward the compound. "Your quarters are ready, basic but functional. I'll be honest, we weren't expecting much from this posting. Ashvari oversight hasn't been helpful in the past, and no offense, but you're useless," Naivara supplied. "It's fine, I've heard." Kessa had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I was going to say untested, but yeah, there are rumors about why you're here." Daniel was already scanning the crop fields visible beyond the settlement, his expression shifting from casual interest to focused concern. "Those fields are dying. Actually dying, not drought-stressed. The color's wrong, the growth pattern's wrong. How long has this been happening?" 8 months, maybe longer. We thought it was weather, then soil exhaustion, then pest infestation. Tried everything, nothing works. Kessa's voice held the flat tone of someone who'd stopped expecting solutions. "We've got maybe 4 months of reserves. After that, we start rationing. 6 systems depend on our surplus. If we fail, people starve." "No pressure then," Daniel said cheerfully. "Can I see your soil analysis reports, irrigation systems, crop rotation schedules?" "All yours. They're in Ashvari script, though." "I'll translate," Naivara said, surprising herself with the speed of her response. "I can read the technical documentation." Both Kessa and Daniel looked at her with varying degrees of surprise. Naivara felt heat rise in her face that had nothing to do with Verdant 4's humidity. "I mean, if that's helpful, I've read agricultural reports before, for my sisters. I wasn't allowed to contribute, but I did the translation work." Daniel's expression did something complicated. "Yeah, that would be incredibly helpful, thank you." Their quarters were indeed basic, 2 rooms, shared facilities, furniture that prioritized function over comfort. Daniel immediately spread his equipment across the main space, creating a workstation that looked like organized chaos. Nivara unpacked carefully, trying not to take up too much space, trying not to be in the way. "Hey," Daniel said, looking up from his datapad. "We're married, this is our space. You're allowed to actually use it. I don't want to interfere with your work." "Nivara," he waited until she looked at him. "You're not an interference. You're supposed to be here. I'm going to need your help with this. The documentation is extensive, it's in Ashvari script, and I'm good with engineering but terrible with logistics. So please actually unpack, claim space. This is your home too, even if it's not what either of us planned." She nodded, throat tight, and finished unpacking with slightly less apology in her movements. They spent the first week reviewing reports that painted a grim picture. Soil pH catastrophically acidic in some fields, alkaline in others, no consistent pattern. Water table dropping. Irrigation systems installed 20 years ago by someone who'd apparently never met hydrology as a concept. Crop rotation schedules that ignored basic agricultural science. Nivara translated page after page, and somewhere around day 4, started adding observations. This field showed failure 3 months before the others. It's also the lowest elevation. If your water table is dropping, it would affect drainage here first. Daniel looked up from his soil samples. "That's a really good catch. What else do you see?" "The irrigation system delivers water during peak heat. You're losing probably 40% to evaporation." And she hesitated. "Sorry, I don't know enough about this." "No, tell me, even if it seems obvious." "The crop rotation schedule doesn't account for nitrogen fixation. You're planting demanding crops consecutively in the same fields. The soil is exhausted because nothing replenishes it between harvests." Daniel stared at her, then at the reports, then back at her. "That's exactly the problem. All 3 things you just identified, that's the crisis. The irrigation timing, the drainage issues, the nitrogen depletion. How did you see that?" "I've been staring at this data for a week." Nivara felt something unfamiliar. It took a moment to recognize it as pride. "I've reviewed thousands of reports for my sisters, memorized patterns, looked for inconsistencies. Nobody ever wanted to hear what I noticed before. I want to hear it, I need to hear it. You're good at this, Nivara, really good." She wanted to dismiss it, to fall back into patterns of self-deprecation worn smooth by years of practice. But Daniel was looking at her like she just solved an equation that mattered, and somewhere in her chest, something that had been crumpled and forgotten started trying to unfold. They spent the next 3 months redesigning the entire agricultural system. Daniel handled engineering, new irrigation with moisture sensors and automated timing, soil amendment protocols, crop selection. Nivara handled logistics, supply chains, worker scheduling, resource allocation across fields. She organized the compound's chaotic inventory system, discovered they'd been overordering some supplies and underordering others, saved them enough in shipping costs to fund 2 additional storage facilities. Kessa started bringing her problems instead of just Daniel. Supply convoy delayed. Could Nivara reschedule the harvests to compensate? Worker dispute over field assignments. Could she mediate? Neighboring settlement requesting technical support. Nivara stared at him. At this human who'd been assigned to marry her like a diplomatic inconvenience, who'd seen value in her when nobody else had bothered looking, who'd helped her rebuild herself from someone who apologized for existing into someone who could actually contribute. "I think I'm falling in love with you too," she said, "which is probably the most inconvenient thing I've ever felt because now I actually care if this works." Daniel laughed. "Yeah, caring is terrible for maintaining emotional distance. Want to try it anyway?" "Yes," Nivara said and meant it. 5 years passed. In the crystalline court, Queen Murethel barely thought of her youngest daughter except when trade reports mentioned Verdant IV's success in passing. Her favored daughters occupied her attention, Karis commanding fleets, Silene growing her psychic influence, both positioned perfectly for succession. She didn't think about Nivara learning to lead. She didn't think about Daniel teaching his wife that being underestimated was an advantage, not a limitation. She didn't think about the partnership building on a forgotten moon, the kind that changed people into who they were actually meant to be. That was her second mistake. The summons from the crystalline court arrived on a morning that had started promisingly and was rapidly deteriorating. Naivara was mediating a dispute between two settlement factions about water rights when the official transport appeared in Verdant 4's sky like an expensive bad omen. The message was formal, mandatory, and addressed to both her and Daniel. Your presence is required at the Crystalline Court for Emergency Succession Council. Attendance is not optional. That sounds ominous, Daniel said, reading over her shoulder while trying to fix their coffee maker, which had developed what he called personality issues, and what she called mechanically questionable life choices. It's probably another ceremony where I stand in the background, and they remind everyone I exist technically. Naivara tried for casual and landed somewhere near resigned. Mandatory attendance usually means they need all three daughters present for political optics. When was the last time you talked to your family? 5 years ago, at our wedding. They've sent exactly 3 communications since then, formal acknowledgments of our annual reports. No personal messages, no questions about how we're doing, no interest beyond whether Verdant 4's numbers look acceptable for trade statistics. Daniel finally coaxed the coffee maker into producing something drinkable through what appeared to be threats and percussive maintenance. You know that's not normal, right? Even for diplomatic marriages, complete silence for 5 years is weird. For my family, it's about what I expected. She took the coffee he offered, grateful for the familiar ritual. I'm the daughter they sent away, out of sight, out of mind, out of the succession calculations that actually matter. They packed for a week-long absence, leaving their second-in-command, Marin, with detailed instructions and emergency protocols. Verdant 4 ran smoothly now, but Naivara still worried. 5 years of work could unravel quickly if the systems she'd built weren't maintained. It'll be fine, Daniel said, catching her expression. You trained everyone well. They know what they're doing because you taught them. That's what good leadership looks like. The transport journey took 3 days. Naivara spent them reviewing court protocols she'd mostly forgotten and trying not to spiral into anxiety about facing her family after years of blessed distance. Daniel spent them reading everything he could find about Ashvari political structure and making notes that looked concerningly like battle plans. You're strategizing, she observed. I'm preparing. Your court spent years treating you like garbage. If they think they can do that again just because we're back in their territory, they're going to discover that humans have opinions about people being cruel to our spouses. Daniel, you can't fight the entire crystalline court. Watch me. They arrived to find the palace in controlled chaos. Guards everywhere, nobles huddled in urgent conversations. The kind of tension that suggested political crisis was either imminent or already happening. Nobody paid attention to their arrival, which would have been familiar except that it felt different now. Naivara noticed the dismissal but didn't internalize it the way she once had. Her attendant Lissa appeared from wherever she'd been waiting 5 years. Princess, you look different. I learned how to do things. Turns out that changes you. Naivara managed a smile. What's happening? The summons said Emergency Succession Council, but no details. Lissa glanced around, then lowered her voice. The Dominion is fracturing. Karis's military leadership has alienated half the allied clans. They're threatening to withdraw from the alliance. Silen's been using psychic influence to intimidate political rivals, and it's backfiring spectacularly. The Queen is trying to hold everything together, but the old clan structures are calling for her removal if she can't control her heirs. So they're failing, and Mother needs all 3 daughters present to project unity. More like they're failing, and she's desperate enough to remember you exist. They were assigned quarters in the family wing, which was new. Previously, Naivara had been housed in guest accommodations, subtle reminder that she was peripheral to the actual family. These rooms were smaller but better positioned, suggesting someone had reconsidered her status, or just run out of space. The emergency council convened that evening. Nivara entered the grand chamber for the first time in 5 years and felt the weight of collective attention like physical pressure. The court had gathered, every important noble, every clan leader, every political player who mattered in Ashvari hierarchy. Queen Murethel sat on her throne looking older, sharper, like she'd been refined by stress into something more dangerous. Kara stood at her right, military perfect, but with tension in her shoulders that suggested the perfection was cracking. Silen occupied the left, psychic presence radiating enough to make sensitive individuals flinch. And then Nivara, entering with Daniel at her side, wearing practical clothes from Verdant 4 because she'd outgrown caring about court fashion, standing differently than she had 5 years ago. The whispers started immediately. She caught fragments, the useless daughter, the agricultural posting. What is she doing here? Queen Murethel's expression flickered with something that might have been surprise before diplomatic neutrality reasserted control. Princess Nivara, Engineer Reeves, welcome home. Thank you, Your Majesty, Nivara said, using the formal address that created distance rather than acknowledging relationship. We came as summoned. The council proceedings were simultaneously complex and straightforward. The Dominion was collapsing, and nobody had solutions that didn't involve violence or coercion. Clan leaders presented grievances with the kind of restrained fury that preceded civil wars. Resource distribution had become catastrophically inequitable, with core worlds hoarding supplies while frontier colonies struggled. Military deployments had become punitive rather than protective. Psychic oversight had crossed from security into oppression. Kara's proposed increased military presence. Show of strength will restore order. Deploy the fleet to contested territories. Demonstrate that rebellion has consequences. The clan leaders erupted. Half of them stood, shouting objections in 3 languages simultaneously. One elderly representative spoke with the kind of quiet authority that cut through chaos. Fleet Commander, with respect, we are not your subordinates to be commanded. We are allies who chose this union. Your solution treats us as conquered territories. That is precisely the problem. Silen tried next, her psychic presence expanding through the chamber like fog. I can sense the intentions driving this unrest. Identify the true instigators, and we can address the root causes surgically. A consortium representative stood, his mental shields visibly engaged. Telepath, we do not consent to psychic examination. That you would suggest it demonstrates why we no longer trust the core world's leadership. You've made surveillance and control your first responses. We remember when this alliance was built on mutual respect. Queen Murethel looked like she was aging in real time, watching her chosen heirs provide solutions that accelerated the crisis rather than resolving it. She turned, almost desperately, to Nivara. Princess, you've been managing colonial operations. What is your assessment? Every eye in the chamber focused on Nivara. The useless daughter asked for her opinion in front of the entire court after 5 years of being forgotten. She felt Daniel's presence beside her, steady and supportive, and remembered that she wasn't the person who'd left this place. She'd spent 5 years learning she was capable, learning she could lead. She stood and her voice came out clear and steady. The crisis isn't primarily military or psychic, it's economic and structural. She pulled up data on the chamber's holographic display, crop yields, resource distribution, trade flow patterns. Information she'd been compiling for years because she'd never stopped being thorough. Frontier colonies produce 80% of agricultural output, but receive 30% of medical supplies and defensive support. Core worlds consume resources without proportional contribution. The inequity has been growing for 2 decades, and military deployment or psychic intervention won't address it. She walked them through the data, showing how trade agreements had slowly shifted from mutual benefit to exploitation, how defensive fleet positioning protected core worlds while leaving frontier territories vulnerable. how the very structure that once made them strong had calcified into something that served the center at the periphery's expense. Verdant 4 was failing when we arrived, she continued. Not because the people were incompetent, but because the system was designed to extract rather than support. We rebuilt it by actually listening to the workers, addressing their real needs, distributing resources equitably. Yields increased 300%, worker satisfaction is measurable, and the techniques we developed, they're replicable. Other settlements have adopted them successfully. She met the clan leader's eyes, then her mother's, then her sister's. You can't command your way out of this, Karis. You can't manipulate your way through it, Silen. The clans aren't rebelling because they're confused or misled. They're leaving because staying has become unsustainable, and they're tired of being treated as resources rather than allies. The chamber was silent. Queen Murethel's expression had progressed through surprise to something that looked uncomfortably like regret. What do you propose? The queen asked quietly. Resource redistribution based on production and need rather than political proximity. Clan representation in core councils with actual voting power, not ceremonial presence. Rotation of administrative positions, so frontier colonies have voice in decisions affecting them. Agricultural and medical technology sharing freely rather than as conditional trade leverage. Nivara pulled up more data, projections, economic models, comparative analyses. It's not complicated. It's just different from how we've been operating. It requires treating allies like partners rather than subjects. One of the consortium leaders leaned forward, studying the projections with intense focus. These models, they're from Verdant 4's operations, and 3 other settlements we've been consulting with. The results are consistent. Equitable distribution increases total output and stability. Everyone benefits, including core worlds, because supply chains become more robust and political tensions decrease. This would require significant restructuring, another clan leader said, but his tone was interested rather than dismissive. Yes, but restructuring is less disruptive than civil war. Nivara kept her voice level factual. The current trajectory ends in fragmentation. Multiple independent territories, disrupted trade, probable military conflicts, or we can adapt, build something more sustainable. It requires the core worlds giving up some centralized control, but maintaining control over a disintegrating alliance seems like a poor trade. Daniel had been silent throughout, but now he spoke up with the casual authority of someone who'd never learned proper reverence for royalty. Where I'm from, we have these things called farmers' cooperatives. Decentralized structures where producers have actual say in governance and resource distribution. They're more stable than top-down systems because people invest in maintaining structures they have voice in. Just a thought. A clan leader actually laughed. Your human speaks more sense than some of our nobility. Perhaps that's the problem. We've been listening to the wrong voices. The council continued for 6 more hours. Not shouting or threatening, but actually negotiating. Clan leaders presented specific grievances, and Nivara worked with them to develop solutions, pulling in Daniel for technical specifications and economic projections. She didn't command or decree. She facilitated, mediated, built consensus piece by careful piece. Karis watched with an expression caught between disbelief and something that might have been jealousy. Silen's psychic presence had withdrawn, no longer needed because nobody was fighting. Queen Murethel was silent, observing her youngest daughter do what her chosen heirs couldn't, actually lead without coercion or manipulation. When the council finally adjourned at midnight, the crisis hadn't resolved completely, but it had de-escalated. The clan consortium agreed to pause secession proceedings while the proposals were formalized. Core world representatives agreed to preliminary resource redistribution. It wasn't peace, but it was breathing room. Nivara and Daniel walked back to their quarters through corridors that felt different than she remembered. Or maybe she was different. 5 years ago, she'd walked these halls trying to be invisible. Now she walked them with the confidence of someone who discovered they could actually do things that mattered. That was impressive, Daniel said. You basically saved the Dominion in one 6-hour negotiation session. I just showed them data and listened to their concerns. Right, which is exactly what nobody else thought to do. Your sisters were too busy trying to dominate, and your mother was too invested in the old power structures. You actually treated people like their perspectives mattered. They reached their quarters to find Queen Murethel waiting outside. She stood alone, without attendants or guards, looking smaller than Nivara remembered. "May I speak with you?" the queen asked. "Both of you." They entered the sitting room, and Nivara waited for whatever this was. Praise that would feel hollow, acknowledgement that came 5 years too late, something. Murethel stood by the window, looking out at the palace grounds illuminated by bioluminescent gardens. When she spoke, her voice carried weight that had nothing to do with authority. "I made a mistake," she said. "Several mistakes. A pattern of mistakes that I've spent the last 6 hours confronting while watching my useless daughter demonstrate more leadership capacity than I've seen in decades." Nivara said nothing. Daniel moved slightly closer, supportive presence without interfering. "I told myself you lacked gifts," Murethel continued. "That you were a genetic anomaly, a daughter who didn't fit the pattern I'd established with Karis and Silen. I told myself hiding you away was kindness, that giving you a remote posting with minimal expectations was mercy rather than cruelty." "It was cruelty," Nivara said quietly. "You can call it whatever you want, but spending 26 years being told I was worthless did damage that I'm still healing from. I know. I'm watching you stand here, confident and capable, and I'm realizing what I discarded." The queen turned to face her. "You have gifts, Nivara, just not the ones I valued. You see patterns, build consensus, create systems that actually work. You lead by listening rather than commanding. Those are extraordinary abilities, and I was too rigid in my thinking to recognize them. Why are you telling me this now? Because I watched my chosen heirs nearly destroy everything tonight, and I watched you save it. Because I'm looking at succession and realizing that the daughter I dismissed might be exactly what the Dominion needs. Because I owe you an apology that I should have given years ago, and I'm hoping it's not too late." Nivara felt emotions she couldn't name churning in her chest. Vindication and anger and grief, and something that might have been the beginning of forgiveness or might have been exhaustion. "You can't command forgiveness," she said. "Can't negotiate it or decree it. It doesn't work that way." "I know, but I can ask if there's—" "I don't know," Nivara said honestly. 5 years ago, I would have done anything for your approval, spent my entire life trying to earn recognition that never came. Now I've built a life where I don't need your validation to know I have value. So I don't know if I have the energy to rebuild a relationship with someone who couldn't see me until I became politically useful." Murethel flinched but nodded. "That's fair, more than fair, and I'll respect whatever you decide, but know that I see you now, Nivara. I see what you've built, who you've become, and I'm proud of you even if I have no right to be." After she left, Nivara sat in silence for a long moment. Daniel made tea, Ashvari style this time, not his terrible earth coffee, and sat beside her without speaking. "I don't know what to do with that," Nivara said finally. "I spent so long wanting her to see me, and now that she does, I'm not sure it matters anymore." "It doesn't have to matter right now," Daniel said. "You don't owe her forgiveness just because she finally figured out she was wrong. You get to decide what kind of relationship you want, if any. Part of me wants to forgive her. Part of me is still that child who needed her mother's approval and never got it. Both those parts are valid. You don't have to choose right now." Nivara leaned into him, grateful for his solid presence. "Thank you for coming here with me, for standing beside me during all of that. Always that's the deal. You and me figuring things out together." He kissed the top of her head. "Though I have to say, watching you systematically dismantle centuries of bad governance with agricultural data and economic projections was incredibly attractive." She laughed despite everything. "You have strange tastes. I have excellent taste. I married you, didn't I? They sat together in the quiet, and Nivara thought about forgiveness and family, and the strange path that had brought her from invisible daughter to someone who could save kingdoms. She didn't have answers yet, but she had time and choice, and someone who'd helped her discover she was worth more than everyone's dismissal had suggested. That felt like enough for now. The crisis erupted 2 days later, during what was supposed to be a formal dinner celebrating the preliminary agreements. Nivara should have known peace negotiations never went smoothly. 5 years managing agricultural settlements had taught her that whenever things seemed stable, someone would find new ways to complicate them. The largest clan consortium, the Outer Reach Coalition, representing 17 frontier territories, arrived with their fleets positioned at the system's edge. Not quite an act of war, but close enough that every defensive sensor in the palace lit up with warnings. Their leader, Elder Matriarch Thessara, strode into the dining hall with the kind of controlled fury that preceded either breakthrough negotiations or complete collapse. The preliminary agreements are insufficient, she announced, dispensing with diplomatic niceties. Core worlds have agreed to minor resource redistribution while maintaining all governing authority. You offer us crumbs and expect gratitude. We're done accepting symbolic gestures while our people suffer. Queen Murethel stood, diplomatic mask firmly in place. Matriarch Thessara, the agreements were designed as first steps. Additional reforms will take years while you debate details and protect your power structures. Our colonies are rationing medical supplies now. Our defensive positions are undermanned now. We cannot wait for the core worlds to slowly consider treating us equitably. Kara stepped forward, military precision in every movement. Your fleets are positioned in clear violation of alliance treaties. Stand down, and we can negotiate in good faith. Stand down so you can dictate terms from a position of strength. Thessara's laugh was bitter. We've been doing that for decades. It's why we're here. Silen's psychic presence expanded, not aggressively but noticeably. Matriarch, your anger is understandable, but fragmenting the alliance will harm your territories more than the core worlds. Let us find compromise. You want to compromise our demands again. Thank you, no. We came to announce our formal secession. The Outer Reach Coalition is withdrawing from the Ashvari Dominion, effective immediately. We'll establish our own governance, manage our own resources, and build relationships with powers who treat us as equals rather than colonial holdings. The dining hall exploded into chaos. Nobles shouting, clan leaders arguing, military commanders reaching for communication devices to mobilize defensive positions. The fragile peace was shattering in real time, and everyone's solutions seemed designed to accelerate rather than prevent catastrophe. Nivara watched her sisters respond exactly as they had before. Karis preparing military options, Silen attempting psychic intervention, both using tools that had already failed because they couldn't imagine different approaches. She looked at Daniel, who raised his eyebrows in that expression that meant your call, but I'm ready to follow your lead. She stood. Her voice wasn't loud, but something about it cut through the chaos, maybe because she wasn't shouting, wasn't threatening, was just speaking with the calm authority of someone who'd spent 5 years solving actual problems rather than performing power. Matriarch Thessara, will you grant me 1 hour? The hall went quiet. Thessara studied her with the kind of assessment that suggested she was cataloging everything from posture to word choice. Princess Nivara, the quiet daughter. I know your work on Verdant 4 and the consulting you've done with frontier settlements. You're the only member of the royal family who's actually visited our territories in the last decade. She paused. 1 hour. But I'll be honest, I don't think words will be enough anymore. Not words, solutions, real ones, not symbolic gestures. Nivara gestured to the side chamber. Please, just listen to what we've prepared. They moved to the council chamber. Thessara and her consortium representatives, Queen Murethel and the core nobility, Nivara and Daniel with their data, and their years of practical experience in making broken systems work. Nivara pulled up projections on the holographic display. Not preliminary agreements or gradual reforms, but comprehensive restructuring. The core worlds will redistribute 50% of medical supplies and defensive resources to frontier territories immediately. Not over years, immediately, emergency protocols, whatever it takes. She showed the logistics. Daniel and I have been running these numbers for 2 days. It's viable, difficult but viable. Core worlds will experience temporary shortages, but nothing critical. Frontier territories get what they need to stabilize. Murmurs from the core nobility. One duke started to object, and Murethel silenced him with a look that could have frozen stars. Second, Nivara continued, full clan representation in the Grand Council with binding votes on resource allocation, defensive positioning, and trade agreements. Not ceremonial presence, actual governing authority. Decisions affecting frontier territories cannot be made without frontier input. She walked them through governance restructuring, showing how distributed authority could actually strengthen rather than weaken the dominion. How having voices from every territory prevented the kind of blind spots that had created this crisis. Third, rotating administrative positions. Frontier representatives will hold core positions on 2-year rotations. Core administrators will serve in frontier territories for equivalent periods. You can't govern equitably if you don't understand the realities of all your territories. That's revolutionary, one core noble said, and it wasn't a compliment. That's necessary, Nivara corrected. The current system is collapsing. Revolution is already happening. The only question is whether it's controlled restructuring or violent fragmentation. Daniel added technical specifications, supply chain logistics, defensive coordination protocols, economic projections showing that equitable distribution actually increased total prosperity for everyone. He presented it with the kind of straightforward competence that made complex solutions seem obvious. Thesara studied the data with intense focus. This level of redistribution, the core worlds would actually do this, immediately. If the alternative is civil war and complete fragmentation, yes, Murethel said. Her voice carried the weight of someone making decisions that hurt but were necessary. Princess Nivara is correct. We've been protecting centralized power while the alliance crumbled. I'd rather maintain a transformed dominion than rule over ruins. You're asking us to trust that this time will be different, another consortium leader said. We've heard promises before. I'm asking you to look at my record, Nivara said quietly. 5 years ago, I was assigned to Verdant 4 specifically to fail. I was the useless daughter, sent to manage a crisis everyone expected would collapse. We rebuilt it by doing exactly what I'm proposing now, listening to the people actually doing the work, addressing real needs, distributing resources equitably. The results speak for themselves. She pulled up more data, Verdant 4's transformation, the 3 other settlements they'd consulted with, testimonials from workers and administrators. Evidence that her approach actually worked when given the chance. I'm not asking you to trust the royal family's promises. I'm asking you to trust the demonstrated effectiveness of systems that value all territories equally. Thesara was quiet for a long moment. Around her, consortium representatives leaned in, whispering urgent consultations. The hour Nivara had requested was nearly up. We need guarantees, Thesara said finally. Legal frameworks that can't be undone by future administrations. Constitutional protections for frontier representation. Automated resource distribution tied to production and need rather than political discretion. Agreed, Nivara said. Daniel and I drafted constitutional amendments. They're comprehensive. They're also legally binding in ways that require consensus to modify, which means future rulers can't simply revoke them when convenient. She showed them the legal frameworks, years of work compressed into documents that could actually hold. Daniel had consulted with human legal experts, comparing governance structures across species, finding principles that worked. You've been planning this, Thesara said. It wasn't an accusation, just observation. I've been watching the Dominion strain against its own structure for 5 years. I love my people, all my people. I don't want to watch them destroy each other over problems that have solutions. Nivara met the matriarch's eyes. I'm not asking you to trust me because I'm royal. I'm asking you to examine the evidence and decide if these solutions address your actual needs. The consortium representatives withdrew to debate. 45 minutes of tense waiting while Nivara's heart tried to beat its way out of her chest, and Daniel held her hand with steady pressure. When Thessara returned, her expression was carefully neutral. The Outer Reach Coalition will suspend secession proceedings for 6 months while these reforms are implemented. If resource redistribution and governance restructuring proceed as outlined, we'll remain part of the Dominion under the new constitutional framework. If core worlds revert to symbolic gestures and broken promises. She let the threat hang unspoken. Understood, Murethel said. You have my word and the binding legal frameworks Princess Nivara has prepared. The Dominion will transform or it will end. I prefer transformation. The crisis de-escalated. Not perfectly. There would be months of difficult implementation, resistance from nobles who preferred the old hierarchies, complications nobody had anticipated. But they had breathing room, had momentum, had something that looked enough like hope that people were willing to try. After the consortium departed and the core nobility dispersed to debate their new reality, Queen Murethel summoned Nivara to her private chambers. Karis and Silen were already there, both looking like they'd been forced to swallow something bitter and were still processing the taste. You saved the Dominion, Murethel said without preamble. Not through military force or psychic manipulation, but through actual governance. Through understanding what people needed and providing realistic solutions. Daniel and I saved it, Nivara corrected. This wasn't just me. But you led it. You saw the crisis clearly when I was blind to it. You built solutions when your sisters could only offer force. The Queen looked at Karis and Silen, her expression complicated. I've been wrong about succession. About what qualities make effective leaders. Your sisters are extraordinary in their domains. Karis will always excel in military strategy, Silen in psychic arts. But governance requires different skills. The ability to listen, to build consensus, to create systems that actually serve people rather than simply controlling them. Karis's expression went carefully neutral. Silen's psychic presence withdrew, self-protective. I'm naming Nivara as Crown Princess, Murethel said. Second in line to the throne, with full authority to continue implementing the reforms she's designed. When I eventually step down, she will inherit. Nivara felt like the floor had disappeared. Mother, I don't want. I know you don't. But you're what the Dominion needs, whether you want it or not. You can continue your work on Verdant 4, build from there rather than from the palace, but you will be crowned princess. The Queen's voice softened slightly. I can't force you to forgive me, can't undo the years I dismissed you, but I can make sure the Dominion benefits from your abilities rather than wasting them. Nivara looked at her sisters. Karis met her eyes steadily, something that might have been respect or might have been grief for lost expectations. Silen nodded slightly, acknowledging the reality even if she didn't like it. If I do this, Nivara said slowly, I do it my way. No court ceremonies if they're not necessary. No performing royalty if governance needs actual work. And Daniel comes with me, equal partner, regardless of what protocols say about human spouses and succession lines. Agreed, Murethel said. Rewrite the protocols if they don't serve. You've already rewritten half our governance structure, might as well finish the job. 1 year later, the Dominion hadn't collapsed. The reforms were progressing, messily, with complications and resistance, but progressing. Frontier territories had representation with teeth. Resource distribution had become equitable enough that crisis rhetoric had shifted to normal political debate. The constitutional frameworks were holding. Nivara and Daniel remained based on Verdant 4, which had become a model colony that other settlements studied. They traveled extensively, visiting frontier territories, working with local administrators, building relationships that previous royalty had ignored. Governance from the ground up rather than mandated from the palace. Queen Murethel visited quarterly, slowly learning that maybe effective leadership looked different than she'd believed. Learning that being wrong didn't mean being weak, that adapting didn't mean surrendering principles, that maybe her useless daughter had been the most valuable all along. Nivara still struggled with forgiveness. Some days she could look at her mother and feel something like understanding. Other days, the years of being dismissed hurt like fresh wounds. But she was learning that forgiveness didn't have to be complete to be real, that relationships could rebuild slowly, that maybe some damage could heal even if scars remained. She stood in the fields of Verdant for one evening, watching the sunset turn the crops golden, Daniel beside her reviewing data on his ever-present tablet. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Agreeing to be crown princess when you could have just stayed out here and lived quietly?" "Sometimes. Mostly I regret that it was necessary, that the Dominion needed saving because previous leadership, including my mother, let things deteriorate so badly." She leaned into him. "But I don't regret proving everyone wrong. Don't regret discovering I could actually do things that mattered. Don't regret any of this with you." Good answer. Very diplomatic for someone who hates diplomatic answers. "I learned from the best agricultural engineer and coffee maker antagonist in the sector." Daniel laughed. "Your mother called me that last visit. Apparently antagonizing kitchen appliances is now part of my official title. Better than useless princess and political pawn. We've both upgraded." They stood together in the growing dark, and Nivara thought about the strange path from dismissed daughter to crown princess. About learning she was capable after years of being told otherwise. About building something meaningful with someone who'd seen her value when nobody else bothered looking. Her mother had married her off expecting failure, expecting her to disappear quietly into obscurity where she couldn't embarrass the royal family. Instead, Nivara had discovered she could transform failing colonies, negotiate political crises, and build governance structures that actually worked. The Queen had regretted it, was still regretting it, learning that dismissing people had consequences, and that sometimes the greatest threats to inadequate power structures were the ones you underestimated most. Nivara had stopped needing her mother's approval, had found something better in approving of herself, in building a life that mattered, in proving that maybe being underestimated was the universe's way of making space for becoming who you actually were. "Come on," Daniel said, interrupting her thoughts. "I think I finally fixed the coffee